Hello, am I audible? Um, can anybody write a comment if you hear my voice clearly? Then I'll move on to my slides. Okay, I assume that I'm audible. Yes, so first of all, first KD Lounge for having me. I feel really honored to be the first speaker of the series. I'm Noam Youngrak Son. I'm a designer based in Eindhoven. And then what I do as a designer is to inscribe myth for the underrepresented in various mediums, from books to performances to 3D printed sex toys sometimes. I'm excited about the unexpectedness that a well-designed fiction can open up, and also a critical political discussions that it may cultivate. I use capability that I have as a designer to visualize and materialize the setup for these technological and ecological bodies in my fiction to play roles in. So I'll be more specific about what I just meant by elaborating on my works that I did this year in 2020. So I'll start with a project that was exhibited very recently at MU Eindhoven. It's called Self-Design Committee, and it uses an Instagram face filter as its main medium. So before talking about the project itself, I'd like to share some thoughts that I have about face filter as a medium. I find face filters as such a fascinating tool to work with, in the sense that it enables everyone to jump over the boundaries of species, gender, and even race sometimes. But of course, it raises a lot of critical questions in detail, such as what is male or female, or like quote-unquote Asian face that is defined by the technical apparatus, how inclusive it is, and what's the political nuance of it. And also, it is not free from the possibilities of horrible political misuses. For instance, there's a horrible custom called Zwarte Piet in the Netherlands, which is essentially white people doing blackface on Sinterklaas as if they are worshipping their colonial past. I'm very relieved that I haven't found any Zwarte Piet face filter yet, but it's still very technically easy to make a face filter that paints your face black. And I'm aware of that there are a lot of people who would be interested in making this kind of filter, even though I certainly disagree with it. So what I want to emphasize first is that making a face filter implies a lot of political precarities, and therefore it requires an immense sensitivity. So nevertheless, back to my project. What I made in the beginning was a public face filter that maps my own face on the faces of whoever that can access Instagram. So this was originally made as my reaction to a question from my transgender clinic doctor if I want to freeze my genetic material before the start of hormonal replacement therapy. That led me to a question of, what's the point of spreading your identity and spreading fragments of your DNA through procreation by making more people who resembles you? In fact, making more people who look like you is rather an easy task. It can simply be done by making a face filter like this. It didn't take me longer than a half an hour to make this first draft of this face filter. So what happened when I spread my identity in such a way? Eventually, what this face filter does is to turn people's digital identities into that of mine, to let them speak, act, perform digitally as me. And it was also to spread out my identity or to give up my authority as a divine decision maker on my identity. Once we all look the same, they're all me, and I'm not an exceptional being compared to them. Like, we're all the same. And ironically, this contradicts what the neoliberal society, or more specifically, what my design education background has taught or obligated me. This relates to a phenomenon that Boris Groys called self-design, especially for a creative working class person like me, but also for any other self-employed person, like an Uber driver and an Airbnb host who cares a lot about their star ratings. There's a growing demand to portray oneself as an appealing commodity, and there's a myth that an individual can overcome the structural injustice by self-designing oneself very ingeniously. But by giving up my authority on my identity, this face filter also distributed the responsibility of self-design that only used to be my own burden and turned it into a collective task. So whoever becomes me by using this face filter can participate in the process of designing my identity by sharing their opinion on what my identity should be like. So from this point, this experiment becomes more fictional. And I started speculating about the formal institution in which this collective self-design process can take place. A stage where the people are invited to share their opinions can be called a committee, an organization of multiple myselfs, which decides everything that are related to self-design of an identity called Noam Youngrak Son. To operate this speculative institution, I sent out a letter to 20 different friends of mine who later become the starting members of the committee. The letter goes like this. Welcome to Noam's Self-Design Committee. I'm Noam Youngrak Son, the founder of this democratic decision-making group. And you're also Noam Youngrak Son, a member of this committee. Self-design is an important task, too important to be dictated by one person. I invite multiple myselfs here to construct my identity collectively. As a member of this committee, I have equal rights and responsibilities. Feel free to use, misuse, construct, deconstruct my identity. And they, not actually they from this point, but different versions of myself were asked to address my opinion on these questions while wearing the face filter. These are the questions that I often had while using social media platforms, and I'll just read those out loud again. What should I do if I cannot sleep because I cannot stop scrolling through my Instagram feed. How much should I care about the number of likes I get? Can I post an ugly selfie on Instagram? Is it moral to proudly post a photo of meat on Instagram? Should I make my account public or private? Should I follow back a stranger that follows me? Do I want to stay in my filter bubble? Does it make sense to keep using Instagram while politically disagreeing with the corporation that owns Instagram? Do I have to keep sharing political posts on Instagram even though I'm feeling skeptical about whether Instagram activism can actually make change? And later, those statements are combined into long debates without a certain conclusion because I didn't devise a voting system or something equivalent to that yet. Maybe there can be some ideas from the audience later about how to reach a conclusion from their expression of ideas from these debates. But before that, I think what we need to question first is if we need a single homogeneous conclusion. Nevertheless, I'm very grateful and proud of this amazing group of myself, especially in the sense that it is more relatable representation of the world's demographics than any other parliament in the world. Probably I'll run out of my fingers to count the number of nationalities of these people, and there's also a very fair representation of LGBTQ population and people of color as well. So I'll show you some excerpts from the discussions that were taking place in my self-design committee.
I would do my best to masturbate. That doesn't always work.
Oh, I shouldn't worry too much about the likes. They come and go, so it's not important at all. Let's just ignore these likes completely. It doesn't really matter.
An ugly selfie on Instagram doesn't exist when you have a beautiful face. An ugly selfie on Instagram cannot happen when you have a beautiful face.
No, it's immoral. And it's pretty disgusting too. And if I see myself posting a photo like that, I immediately unfollow myself.
You know, I like posting stuff like this, but now I'm applying for jobs and I don't want my possible future employers to see these things. So I think I should put my account on private and not share these kind of images with everyone.
If they are hot, follow them back.
I would like to get out of my filter bubble, but to be honest, I don't know how to get out of there.
It's a complicated decision, and it often feels like a contradictory one to be using a platform that we know is corrupt. But I believe in the power of people to co-opt and infiltrate these platforms in order to use them the way that we need to as tools.
I think activism is not linear. It's not a do or die. It's a constant process of learning. So as long as an Instagram is not an endpoint for me, I would like to engage with it. I would like to post political content, engage, disagree.
And furthermore, in every institution, transparency is important. And in order to make the activities of my self-design committee more transparent and public, I exhibited this institution at MU Eindhoven as a part of their exhibition called the Self-Design Academy, which was over quite recently. Alternatively, you can witness all of those conversations that were going on my committee on the official Instagram account of the committee. And you can even try the face filter and become a member of the committee and join the discussion as well. And moreover, I want to share some critical questions that I encountered while running this institution. This is the flattened photo of my face, which is later used for facial mapping of the filter. you'll see the watermarks on my face saying self-design committee. That wasn't only to indicate that this filter is for the committee, but also to make Facebook happy about their regulation being met. So, yeah. The very first version of this filter without watermarks was declined by Facebook since it contained a photorealistic representation of a human face. And I had to add the watermarks to make it appear less like deepfakes. I do think the regulation has a point because for sure they need a measure against deepfakes. But what this also shows is that the self-design committee is dependent on the technical infrastructure that the big tech corporations provide. And those infrastructures are mostly just as biased as everyone is. For instance, the face template texture that Facebook provides is based on the idea of gender binarism, only supposing that there are only male and female faces. And the platform doesn't appear very inclusive for the gender identity of the self-design committee of mine. This leaves a question: how can the self-design committee deviate from the biases that are already prevalent on the apparatus that it relies on? So I want all of you to speculate about your own self-design committee that probably works more or less, but not exactly like that of mine. Who can legitimately be in your self-design committee? Who profits from the operation of the committee? Who is exploited by your committee? What resources and infrastructure does your committee rely on? And which cultural background does your committee function? How does it deal with the unforeseen disputes with someone else's self-design committee? How would your self-design committee systemically differs from that of mine? If you have very certain answers for these questions, please share it on the comment section of this YouTube live stream, even though I cannot see it by having this presentation now. Meanwhile, I'll move on to the next project. The next project is called Money in Vivo. In vivo in Latin means in body, and it's often used in biology to refer to the reactions that are happening in organisms. This project started when COVID-19 was still a regional disease in China. What inspired me about this project was an essay that I wrote called Becoming a Bat Embodying COVID-19. I call it a written trace of the fictional thinking to fight the fear, helplessness, and anger about the political stupidity that the coronavirus pandemic unveiled. I started writing it when the first case of COVID-19 infection was reported in the Netherlands, and also by witnessing a surge in hate crimes against Asians, followed by the global spread of the virus. The essay starts with a video clip that I watched on YouTube. The man in the video is called Bear Grylls, so-called adventurist. I'll just read out like a part of the essay. I saw a video of Bear Grylls, so-called adventurer, violently hunting the bats in China in a TV show called Man vs. Wild. The muscular white man used smoke to repel bats from a cave and struck the fleeing bats with an improvised racket. Then he stomped on them, proudly showed off the struggling creature to the camera. The video appears to be very symbolic since the main event of the video is an expression of the power relation between the subject, Bear Grylls, and the object, bats. There are multiple elements that distinguish Bear Grylls from the bats. Bear Grylls or bats, man or wild, healthy-looking or seemingly disease-carrying, white or non-white, male or not specifically male, modern or uncivilized. Starting from him, I jumped between various concepts as an attempt to deconstruct interracial, intercultural, interspecies prejudice, starting from my thoughts on becoming a bat. which is a species that is accused as a source of virus and often referred as a xenophobic insult toward East Asians. From that point, after touching more interspecies agents, including Bear Grylls, Dizine, Bill Gates, lichens, bacteria, and bacteriophages, mitochondria, eventually this essay returned to the topic of COVID-19 and concludes with questions that redefine the human coronavirus relationship. We all already have an embodied, I'm just reading out from the essay. We all already have an embodied experience of forming an endosymbiotic relationship with bacteria. Why not form a similar relationship with COVID-19? What can we offer them and what can they offer us? I haven't asked them yet, so I'm not very sure about their possible offers. Still, as a human being, I'm willing to offer them a few of my ribosomes so that they can produce protein, some enzymes such as RNA polymerase if they want, a part of my ER membrane they can envelop themselves in, Golgi vesicles in case they want to be transported out. If they pirate those from me, we call it case of coronavirus infection, but if I provide it for them, we could frame it differently. And while writing this text, one question that I discovered was, what if the virus becomes the new currency so that we can purchase goods and services with a virus? Then I dived into that question and eventually designed this fictional body part as a starting point. In the fictional context, which people uses virus as currencies, what people use instead of what we call wallet now is this gland that they're all born with. It's an organ that has evolved to accumulate viruses. It also mediates the exchange of viruses through portals on its surface that connect the virus storing tissues to the outside. Shapes and colors of these virus glands are very diverse because they are constantly infected and deformed by the high concentration of virus in it. The more virus one has in the gland, the splendid the gland will look. Thus, in this era, goods and services can be purchased with a virus. The transaction can be done unconsciously through the viral gland, but sometimes unintentionally by coughs, sneezes, and touches and exchanges of bodily fluid. And those unconscious payments are like what we call tax now. So most of the countries have built a system for collecting those free-released virus for running social services. Our perception of money is not singular. I mean, this part I return to reality from the fictional context. So our perception of money and virus is not singular. And the way of dealing with an economic crisis or a pandemic differs from person to person, from country to country. And therefore, if the virus becomes the currency, there should be a lot of different ways that this currency works. And I wanted to capture this diversity. The way that different countries dealt with the pandemic, especially in the early stage of it, was so diverse. And they, for instance, there are countries that are doing strict lockdown, and at the same time, there are countries that are believing in so-called herd immunity. Likewise, we have so many different economic perspectives, like socialist, liberalist, social democrats, libertarians, and etc. And so this big fictional metaphor that I coined here, the virus becoming money, gave me more insights about how polyvocal our views on the topic of both economy and coronavirus pandemic. This made me revisit this article that speculated about how coronavirus will change the economy, written by an ecological economist called Simon Mayer. So in this article, he categorized this scenario into four categories using two factors. The first factor is if it's centralized or not, and the second factor is if it prioritizes human lives or the market. So I find this very relevant in the sense that it wasn't foreseeing a destined single future, but only providing a spectrum of what it might be. So I interviewed the ecological economist, the author of this essay, and shared what the fictional story that I was writing. And after this talk, I was able to create different stories that are widely spread on the frameworks that are proposed that was previously coined by him. And each of these microfictions, each frames that you see on this diagram, is represented by a figure which is essentially myself in different face filters. Such as a user of a life-threatening virus exchange dating app, or a bat who played an incredibly important role in this economic fiction, because bats have an outstanding ability of storing virus in their body. They're like a living bank account in this story. And there was also a leader of a political party that provides an obligatory healthcare to prevent people from privately owning virus. And lastly, there was a stay-at-home spouse who receives their basic virus income through a companionship with a bat. Eventually, I invited all of those people at a 35-minute long talk show in which they discuss and debate how to overcome the economic injustice that they were facing. So this project was exhibited as a part of Impossible Bodies, which is a virtual exhibition that was taking place in the Netherlands. And every character, as I mentioned earlier, every character that appears in this film was performed by myself using different face filters. And I find this relatable to my political opinion is also as polyvocal as this. These conversations taking place in this fictional context might be happening already in my mind or anyone else's mind that is living in this crazy time of COVID-19. Yeah, I'd love to share the whole film with everyone, but I think it's too long for this evening. But if you're curious, you can find the full footage of this screening that took place during the exhibition on YouTube if you search Money in Vivo on YouTube. And yeah, I prepared like a 12-minute excerpt from the film, but I'll only play it maybe after the talk if there is some like leftover time. As a conclusion of this project, what sometimes amazes me is how rapid the reality overpowers the fiction. The world is so unpredictable, and it sometimes makes my fiction partly a non-fiction. I think this is a clear example for that, the article that you're seeing now. So people once had an idea of making an immunity certificate that certifies that some people are immune to COVID-19 so that they can, be more economically active during the lockdown. And this turns a significant part of my fictional stories that I just shared into a non-fiction, because what we call currency is also a form of certificate, a certificate which guarantees a certain economic value that you are holding. Like if you're holding a €1 bill, it assures that you own an economic value that is equivalent to €1. Nevertheless, a lot of interesting observations can be found when a fiction and reality collides, I think. So I'll move on to the next project. The following project is the most hilarious one that among the projects that I'm introducing this evening, I think. And this is also my favorite project from mine. And back then I was looking for how to call these jumper cables that you use for Arduinos, and discovered that these cables are called male to female jumper cable. Yes. And also figured out that this terminology is very widely used. So people classify genders to electric cables based on, if they insert their connector to another cable, or if it lets the other cable to be inserted in it. And I find this terminology extremely problematic in the sense that it violently reduces the idea of gender into a simple question of if you plug or if you're plugged. However, gender is a social concept, and it includes much more intricate nuances than that. But if you closer how the individual items are called is very hilarious. Like this one is called gender changer, male to female, top male plug, male pin strip, 3 positions, straight female to female connector. I mean, I didn't make this up. It's the real product names that are being sold on Amazon at the moment. So even though I'm very critical about this language use, it also includes some possibility to change our perceptions about gender and sexuality. So let's say that an electric cable is a person, and the part that connects them with, the other cables are their genitals. So first of all, unlike humans, electric cables can have multiple sets of genitals, like you see from this slide, because they are designed to connect one point to another. Therefore, the gender of their genitals are binary, but every cable have more than one set of genitals at once. So the gender of an electric cable becomes very ambiguous, like what you can see from this image. Furthermore, the cables always make more than one connections at the same time. So it's much more deviant than the monogamous intimacy that we're making. Cables are always having intimacy with more than one cables. So eventually, what I learned from them is that their mechanism of gender are way more queer than our idea of gender. So our electric infrastructure that involves countless cables is in a way like a giant orgy in this regards. And it turns a sexual intercourse in an architectural scale. So, and it's interesting how it differs from the architectural infrastructure that we have for sex. For instance, if you see the floor plan of a sex hotel, it's nothing more than a combination of rooms for couples, for 2 people, which is strictly based on monogamy. So from this point, we can speculate about then what would a sex hotel in this speculative context in which we form sexual intercourses like the cables would look like. So it's the hotel architecture of sex hotel that is designed with that premise. So it's constructed like a rhizome, which is like an sort of unidirectional connections of a lot of small chambers for one person. And also, like from this, I could also design so many artifacts that are constructing our sexual infrastructure, such as this sex chair that you're seeing, or sex toys. All of these are based on the same idea. Like, what if we, form sexual intercourses like electric cables, and it's a concrete reflection of this. So eventually, this idea was formulated into a manifesto book, which is bound with an electric cable, like this. And you can purchase this book in Amsterdam at Sans Serif in Rotterdam, 9 booksellers, in Brussels, Rio Space. So yeah, I'll just read out the last part of the manifesto that I wrote. The world of the gendered cable is not utopian, dystopian, egalitarian. Gendered cables make the connections that may not be predefined. It may be malleable and always in flux, that may be multi-directional. Gendered cables make the connections not only for procreation or pleasure. Gendered cables carry electricity, bodily fluid, genetic information, social hierarchy, and structure. Gendered cable disturb the gender binary by ambiguating, converting, splitting, multiplying their genitalia, which may not be binary. Gendered cables blur the distinction between their bodies. The artifacts between the bodies, artifacts, and the architecture. It is ambiguous if they are natural or artificial. It consequently deconstructs the boundary of an individual, where an individual body starts and ends. Yes, so I'll move on to the last project that I'm introducing this evening. The last project that I'm willing to share with you is called Hotel Symbiogenesis. Hotel Symbiogenesis is a collaborative project which I directed, and also I designed scenography for it, and I was a main story writer and main designer for its graphical identity. The aim of this investigation was to rethink the human-non-human animal relationship by questioning how the human species have been valuing animal-derived clothing material, and to create alternative mythology, which is not a denial of autonomy and subjectivity of non-human animals, specifically concerning the consumption of their skin and fur. So the first major axis of the project was story writing, and during this phase, I created 5 different fictional animal species and elaborated on their ways of living. The concept of each animal developed into a tale about an ecosystem and eventually become a mythology about an island in which various animal species, including a group of humans, cooperate, co-evolve, and withstand the ecological disasters. And this story building process was accompanied by hands-on speculation, what we call. So it was a collaboration. It was a very international collaboration of a group that includes craftspeople and textile designers all around the world, and they crafted the skins and furs of the fictional animals that I came up with in the previous stage using their original craft techniques. So this methodology, which we call speculative craft, provided significant insights and inspiration about the tactility of the narrative. And during the later stage of the project, the craftspeople began designing the objects using the speculative leathers that they crafted, being in the shoes of the human dwellers of the island. So, yeah. So the design process of it functioned as a big thought experiment that explored the human perception of the animals, and it was significantly referenced by the story writing process which I was leading to depict the human-non-human relationship on the island. The use of in this design process, the use of real animal-derived material was excluded because there was a consensus that it makes no sense to consume products of animal exploitation for the creation of non-anthropocentric mythology. So eventually, so these are the materials that our collaborators crafted. And eventually, we constructed a story of an island which works like a big symbiotic cell that survives the nearly apocalyptic time, operating through the symbiosis of its dwellers. The story was told from the perspective of 6 girls, and the narrator of each chapter was born shortly after the death of the one from the previous chapter. Their stories depicted how they lived with a particular animal species that have emerged around the period that they were alive. This indicated that humans are not exceptional in this relationship, and also various human rituals in this society had co-evolved with the animals in the way that is far from one directional and exploitative. They made their garments and objects using materials derived from these animals, which gives us a glance at how those humans cohabit with the animals. So during the Dutch Design Week, the project was presented at Temporary Art Center in Eindhoven. And yeah, the exhibition proposed a combination of speculative letters, objects, and stories by having a theme of a hotel room for the island dwellers. And yeah, the hotel room was like a geodesic dome, and it symbolized the island and the biosphere that it contains. And a visitor was placed as a very temporary visitor in it. The narrative was communicated through sensorial experiences that involved a kinetic light projection on the dome and an audioscape installation that surrounds it. So the electronic musician, Co De Beer, that we were collaborating with, augmented the sounds of the speculative animals by using generative instruments that are not really controlled by the player, but kind of plays as, very autonomous sound by the settings that it has. So nevertheless, I'll share a 5-minute snippet of the exhibition for most of you who couldn't visit the exhibition. Yes, hope you enjoyed the snippet of the exhibition. Yeah, lastly, I want to note like a few things about the design process of the exhibition. That this project began shortly before the emergence of COVID-19 as a global pandemic, and it certainly reshaped the design process of it. So one of the core member of the collective is still in Singapore because of the travel restriction, and we couldn't work together physically as we planned. It was very ironic that human travels were restricted, whereas goods and services and goods and informations could still be transported. So the production of this exhibition had to spread all around the world due to closures of the workshops in Eindhoven. So it's eventually spread out to Seoul, Berlin, East Success, Singapore, which made the members of the collective more autonomous in their designing task, and it also made us discover the local craftspeople. For instance, the craftspeople who crafted the beautiful rattan frame that you're seeing on the lampshade and the room divider. It was a very happy accident. Like if it wasn't for COVID-19, we could have never discovered this amazing person. And it made us question about the colonial power relation of the design process. That there always have been one side of the world that is producing the design discourses, and the other side of the world that is passively perceiving it. But at this point of the global history, where the agency of design is forced to be spread out globally due to pandemic, could be a good chance to overcome that hierarchy, I thought. So it also reminds me of the period when Bauhaus was dissolved by the Nazis, and different versions of Bauhaus were formed all around the world, including in the U.S., in Israel, and Japan. So in the end, I'm not proposing this project as a very ideal example, but I think it could be a hint for the post-COVID design collaboration that is maybe a bit more desirable than the strict Euro-American hegemony that is very apparent in the design world. So this exhibition can be virtually experienced on our virtual platform www.hotelsymbio.com. So if you're interested in the detailed stories of each animal, you can find more information on this website. And as a wrap-up of this presentation, I will introduce a question that is asked by KD Lounge organizing team. They asked me like a month ago to choose a physical material that represents me as a designer the most. And that was an interesting question because most of my design practices are very immaterial, as you just saw now. And at the end, I chose paper, a blank sheet of paper, in the sense that it's an empty container for meanings and values. It implies limitless speculative possibilities, such as having writings, drawings, paintings, and prints on, or even like being folded into 3D shapes, or shredded and sprinkled in the air all around the space. Except there can be so many ways that paper can be fictionally used. I think. I just realized that I put the wrong image. But back to the paper. I think the aspect of containing resonates with Ursula K. Le Guin's essay, The Carrier Bag Theory of Fiction, which I love. It's a book called Carrier Bag Theory of Fiction. I'll just quickly show you what it looks like. I wanted to have this image in the slides, but it was somehow not included. But it's a very small book, and so just to briefly introduce like what this book is about. Unlike the story of Swords, a story in which a heroic protagonist, who is usually a man going through all the adversities, defeating all the enemies and achieving victory, the carrier bag theory of fiction works like a carrier bag of a hunter-gatherer. So in her perspective, in Ursula Le Guin's perspective on writing a fiction, a story emerges from various arbitrary, undefined elements that the hunter-gatherers encounter during their daily trip, like looking for food, and put together in a carrier bag. So like Le Guin's carrier bag, an empty sheet of paper can be filled with different elements of a narrative and give a room for a mythology to emerge. However, another aspect of paper that we shouldn't overlook is that it's usually very white. White is a very ambiguous adjective. It's the color of modernist industrial design and sometimes even associated with racism and colonialism. And I think we should question what makes a sheet of paper white. What fuels the whiteness of paper? Probably the timbers that they use for making paper is not as white as paper. Probably closer to my skin tone or even darker than that. In the case of paper, its whiteness consists of the industrial bleach, exploitative labor, and timber monoculture. The society that I'm living in, it is also very white. Not saying that it only consists of white people, but it appears to be white because that's the people that are represented. I think we need to critically question what this whiteness consists of and what, how this whiteness is represented in our culture, our media, and infrastructure. Yes, this is a photo that I took during my summer holidays last year. And back then it was the 100th anniversary of Bauhaus. And I was traveling from Weimar, where Bauhaus was founded, to Dessau, and eventually to Berlin to follow the chronological path of Bauhaus. And these puppets were the only Asians that were active or represented in Bauhaus. It was only later that I realized that there were a Japanese couple that studied in Bauhaus almost at the end of the history of the school. But nevertheless, things hasn't changed that much. So throughout my bachelor year, I haven't had any tutor that was a person of color. The faculty of my school is just as white as Bauhaus. The Bauhaus in the time when these puppets were made. In this context, I think my role as a designer is to contaminate this white paper, to performatively write and draw on it, to make it less white, to contaminate this sheet of paper while creating additional values on it. I think this can be a conclusion of this talk today. Thank you all for listening. How much time do we have still? So we have, I'll just check all the comments. From maybe now, I'll just react to the questions of Maya and Rebecca. Let me make myself visible again. 1 second. Yes, to answer the questions from the audience. When are you graduating, and what are your plans for the future? So I'm in the last year of my study. Thank you all for the reactions, by the way. So I'm in my last year of study. I graduated in 2020 July, I assume, and my future plan. I don't want to be too dramatic or too too planned about my future as if there's like a certain destiny that I have to follow. I'm just going to create the things that seems the most relevant to me. By whenever I face certain topics that I want to act on. And I think also a very important issue there is how to keep that practice sustainable. Like in terms of finance, in terms of health, in terms of creativity, and yeah. To achieve that, I'm trying to make my practice kind of smaller scaled, also to make it more radical, and to be published very frequently. And the next question, what do you make a difference between art and design? I always call myself a designer, not an artist. But I don't mind. I mean, there are a lot of people that are calling me an artist, and I don't necessarily mind about that. But I am a designer because I was educated in the discipline of design. The most of the methodologies that I use for the creation of my work is pretty much similar to the design processes of product designers who design chairs. But I think the core difference is if it's radical or not. And I think I sacrifice certain, for instance, commercial possibilities, usabilities to make it more radical, more closer to the root of the problems that I'm facing. Yes. So that was more or less an answer for the art and design question. Define the relation between politics and design in your work. So a lot of concept related to fiction. How does? Well, everything is essentially a political phenomenon, I think. The most banal and personal experiences that I'm having in my daily life is in a way like a product of the political intersections that I'm living on, I think. In that sense, I think it's just inseparable. Politics and design is inseparable. And even the most banal IKEA chair would probably have a very specific political implication, such as it reflects capitalism. It reflects consumerist culture. It reflects how the labor is exported to the developing part of the world. It's impossible to not mention politics when somebody's talking about design, I think. From Bianca, how much has the institution supported or even drained you? Well, I think I have to be a bit diplomatic to answer this. Well, it's a very difficult question to coin this, not to offend anyone. I truly appreciate the education that I had at the Design Academy, also in the sense that it allows, I mean, I assume, I wonder how the educational situation in the other schools are, but I assume that the kind of, stuff that I've been doing probably is very likely to be not accepted in the other art schools, I think. I don't know. I'm curious about the opinions of the others. Yeah, I mean, I find this question really difficult to answer. Thank you for asking this critical question, Bianca. But if you are curious about what Design Academy, what the education at Design Academy actually looks like, there's a Facebook page that I really recommend you, which is called Calling Out. One second. Yeah, call out Dutch art institutions, and it includes a lot of daily experiences that the students of the Dutch art institutions are facing. So yeah, I highly recommend this page to you as an answer to your question. Yeah, we have a bit of time left. If there's no more question, I'll just play the excerpts from my film Money in Vivo, which will be like 12 minutes, and then I will conclude my event like that. But thank you all for joining me. I really appreciate the questions and the reactions that you've been giving. So I'll share the screen again. Oh yeah, I didn't realize that I wasn't sharing the screen, but I'll just drop the link of the Instagram page that I just mentioned on the chat. And I'll play the video and I'll call it a day. Thank you all for joining me. Welcome to Money in Vivo, a talk show not only about making money, but understanding money. The issue that we're going to talk about today is economic inequality. We invited 4 guests from various countries to talk about how economic inequality appears differently and how we should deal with it. So let's give a round of applause for Morgan, Chris, Riley, and Alex. Thank you all for joining us tonight. Can you briefly introduce yourself to our audience, starting from Morgan?
Hi, my name is Morgan. Thank you for having me tonight. I'm 25 years old. I don't have a particular job, but I mainly earn by using a smartphone app called Chiro. Today I want to share how individuals rely on a digital platform in an economically unequal world.
Yeah, I'm Chris. I'm about 20 years old. I live in a blue group consisting of a major collections in the back. We recently migrated to a country called Cappadocia from the country next to it called Ethiopia. A lot of our members were dead from the shoots in Ethiopia when we were migrating. Today, I want to talk about the economic inequality and nationalism.
Hi, I'm Riley. I'm the representative of a political party called the Low Immunist Union, the LIU in short. I'll share how we achieved equality through centralized healthcare.
Hi, my name is Alex. I'm a stay-at-home spouse and freelancer writer. Today I want to introduce the policy of universal back companionship through which I earn my monthly income.
Thank you, and I'm so excited to hear more about y'all. First of all, I would like to ask a question to Morgan about the app that you just mentioned. What is it, and how do you earn from it? Can you show us how the app works?
Of course. So this is the app. And these are the notifications that you receive when somebody likes you. This says somebody sent you a bat. It's from a person called John, 28 years old, 30 kilometers away, virus similarity 98%.
What is virus similarity? Is it good that it is 98%?
Not at all. It means that most of his virus are what I already have. It doesn't make any sense if I earn what I already have from the exchange.
Oh, now I understand. Because what counts as money is diversity, not the quantity of viruses. So you're probably not going to accept him, right?
Definitely. I'll wash this person away.
We will get back to more details about the app, but before that, I have more questions for our guests. Now I would like to ask Chris. Chris, what happened to your herd?
We are a big herd, and we habitually migrate once every few hundred years. And back then, we migrated from a country called Charopia to another country called Polydosia. There's a strict economic hierarchy between two countries. The economy of Polydosia is dependent on that of Charopia, and Charopia exploits Polydosia as a cheap source of labor. Charopian zoologists could notice that we are likely to move to Polydosia.
And how did the humans react? Was that why the shooting happened, as you mentioned earlier?
They were extremely concerned about losing their wealth, and an enormous amount of money stored in hundreds of thousands bahts could be transferred all at once to Polydosia if we migrate. Thus, they devised diverse measures to prevent this from happening, but all of those didn't work, and as a frantic last-ditch effort, the Charopian army shot at our herd in the air.
Thank you so much for sharing that tragic history with us. Now, I would like to ask Riley about their political party. Riley, can you introduce the Low Immunist Union to our audience?
The Low Immunist Union was formed after the Low Immunist Revolution. Since then, we've been ruling the country for over 15 years. The LIU stands against the private ownership and market-driven exchange of viruses, and we stand against the high immunists and their extravagant virus clans that reproduce wealth by exploiting the health of low immunists. The state develops and uses biotechnology exclusively to prevent the private reproduction of wealth. Storing of capital is centralized in one big cell that is taken care of by the state. The state is responsible for the stable conservation of the cell.
I assume that it must require very strict control.
Yes, we find it necessary. For instance, physical distancing and lockdown are enforced to prevent the personal exchanges of viruses. We also regulate the design of buildings and vehicles to be able to provide enough space for keeping distances of at least 1.5 meters. Furthermore, a portrayal of physical intimacy is prohibited. Platonic long-distance relationship and in vitro fertilization are recommended. People are obliged to wear face masks with an automatic lock and GPS in their daily lives. It's actually very handy because it also tracks your heart rate, blood pressure, hormonal status to keep you healthy. And for sure, it prevents the transmission of money.
I haven't asked Alice anything yet. Alex, during your introduction, you mentioned the policy of universal bat companionship. Could you explain what that is?
It was a serious problem that a considerable number of the population were excluded from the economic system. Those people were not economically represented and appreciated enough, even though they significantly contributed to society in various forms of immaterial labor. For instance, by domestic labor, care work, and creative labor. So, in response to this issue, the Ministry of Health and Finance devised this program to ensure the social and economic rights of citizens regardless of their ability to earn. It operates by linking each citizen with a companion bat to share living space.
A companion bat? Is it the one that is flying around you?
Yes, this is my companion bat. A companion bat stays at home during the day and flies out every night to eat and mate. A companion human that provides shelter and care for the bat can earn money that the bat brings home from his nightly flight on a regular basis. This becomes a considerable amount of money because bats have an amazing ability of gathering and storing viruses. This income allows people to live their lives in dignity without exploiting their health.
That sounds like an ingenious way of combating economic inequality, but I'm also very curious about the opinion of Chris if it's also a good idea for bats.
Yes, I also wanted to question if the policy merely instrumentalizes bats for human welfare.
Fair point, and that's why we call it not livestock but a companion.
But isn't it just rhetoric?
We have some policies that support it. For example, abusing one's companion bat is punishable by a maximum penalty of at least 5 years of imprisonment.
But apart from how safe the environment is the relationship ever consensual?
That's totally different from the way we treat bats. As many of you have mentioned earlier, bats naturally hold an immense amount of capital within them, and as a state, we've been trying our best to control it. One thing we've been doing is to propagate the idea that the bats are evil, vicious, harmful, and dangerous animals, so that people avoid contact with a bat.
Sorry to interrupt, but I feel offended.
I understand that it would not be pleasant to be demonized, but we had to protect our people from money. Bats have been traditionally associated with wealth and higher economic class status, which we ideologically disagree. What we problematize are not the bat themselves, but the way that their images have been consumed by the people.
By being in a companion relationship with a bat, I learned a lot about how to live with non-human species, especially in this time in which viruses work as currencies. Any creature owning a virus can act as an economic subject, and thus we need to rethink the relationship between not only bats, but also every species.
I certainly agree. While listening to your story, I also thought non-humans, especially animals, can become an important stakeholder in the free market. I will try to dilate the way that the idea of market in business has been defined.
We finally have a shared opinion. I also learned from the stories of Alex and Chris that economic inequality is perhaps not only interpersonal or international issue, but even an interspecies issue. I deeply regret expelling bats from our society. After this talk, I will work on revising our healthcare service to include non-humans, especially bats. As long as they can be infected by money, we feel a great responsibility to take care of them.
I find it very meaningful that this long conversation constructively concludes as an initiation of a new conversation. Noam, can you invite us again next time to collectively speculate about non-anthropocentric economic systems?
Yeah, I would love to provide you a stage for that. So I'll see all of you again next week and discuss how our economic systems can be inclusive for non-humans.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for tuning in. Have a lovely evening. And to answer Olga's question, you can design as freely as you want anywhere. If you have a